The night shift at a 24-hour diner isn't for everyone. Most people hate the long hours, the drunks coming in after the pubs close, and the smell of burnt coffee that seems to soak into your clothes. But I didn't mind it. There was something about the steady rhythm of the job that suited me. Refill the ketchup bottles, top up the napkins, take the orders. The nights passed quietly, usually. That night started like any other. It was a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, sometime after midnight. The diner was never busy at that hour. A couple sat in the far booth sharing a plate of chips. Two lorry drivers were at the counter chatting and nursing mugs of coffee. In the corner, a man in a scruffy jacket stared blankly at a crossword, his pen hovering over the paper but never moving. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting the same flat light they always did, and the radio behind the counter was playing something soft and tinny. I was wiping down tables, trying to kill time. The smell of grease hung in the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of the cherry pie spinning lazily in the display case. Everything was normal, ordinary, and then the lights went out. The whole diner plunged into blackness so fast it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. I froze where I was, the damp cloth still in my hand. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the wall and the distant rumble of a car passing outside. After what felt like forever, the lights flickered back on. The buzz of the fluorescents returned harsh and steady, and the radio crackled back to life. Everything looked the same, except for one thing. The diner was empty. The couple in the booth, the drivers at the counter, the man with the crossword, they were all gone. The tables were still set, the coffee cups half full, the napkins crumpled where they'd been used, but the people weren't there. I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response, just the steady flicker of the lights and the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. I went to the door, peering out into the car park. The lorries that had been parked out front were gone too, not a trace of them, just wet tarmac glistening under the streetlights. I felt a tightness in my chest as I moved back inside, my shoes squeaking on the tiles. I checked the kitchen. Empty. The storeroom. Empty. The toilets. Empty. Every corner of the diner was deserted, but everything else was exactly as it had been. It was as though everyone had been plucked away mid-action, leaving only their things behind. I stood behind the counter, gripping the edge of it so hard my knuckles ached. Then the lights flickered again, once, twice, and went out. This time the darkness felt thicker, like it had a presence of its own. I couldn't see a thing, not even my hand in front of my face. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the distant rattle of the rain. I stayed still, listening, my breath shallow. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe hours. It felt endless. Then, just as suddenly as before, the lights came back on. Everything was normal again. The couple were back in the booth, leaning over their shared plate of chips. The drivers were at the counter, laughing over some private joke. The man with the crossword was in his corner, pen still hovering over the page. No one looked at me. No one seemed to notice anything had happened. They carried on as if nothing was out of place. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The radio played on. I felt like I was standing in a dream or maybe a nightmare. My reflection stared back at me from this window, pale and wide-eyed. The rain outside had picked up, blurring the view of the car park. The clock ticked on the wall. The smell of grease and cherry pie hung in the air. And the diner carried on just as it always had. Working the toll booth isn't the most exciting job in the world. It's a lot of sitting around, listening to the same local radio station and counting change. Nights especially are long. You can go hours without seeing a single car, just you and the cameras, the occasional breeze rattling the glass, and the dull glow of the monitors. I didn't mind it. You get used to the quiet. It was Thursday when it happened, or maybe Wednesday. The days blurred together when you worked nights. I remember the rain, though, drumming steadily on the roof. It made the booth feel smaller somehow, cozier, but also like the walls were closer than they usually were. The camera monitor was glowing, faint shapes of the road ahead flickering in black and white. You didn't usually see much on it unless a car was coming. The road stretched out into nothing, swallowed by the dark. There was a kind of comfort in that, in the sameness of it all. Except that night something was different. I spotted the headlights first, two bright dots appearing on the screen, far out on the approach. A car was coming. Not unusual, though traffic at that hour was rare. I sat up, ready to hit the button to lift the barrier. But the car didn't arrive, it just kept coming on the screen. I watched as the headlights grew brighter, the outline of the car becoming clearer. It was a four-door saloon mid-sized. The camera picked up the gleam of rainwater running down the bonnet. It looked ordinary. The weird thing was, it didn't seem to get any nearer. I glanced at the booth window, expecting to see the glare of headlights cutting through the rain, but there was nothing out there, just the black road stretching off into the storm. I looked back at the monitor. The car was still there, still moving, or at least it seemed like it was moving. The angle never changed, the frame never shifted. It stayed the same, locked in place on the screen like it was stuck. I thought there must have been a glitch. It wouldn't have been the first time. The cameras were old and the system wasn't much better. I tapped the side of the monitor, nothing happened. The car stayed on the screen, headlights cutting through the rain. The longer I watched, the stranger it felt. There was no sign of the driver or any passengers. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the rain streaking down the glass. Then the screen flickered and the car was gone. Just like that. The road was empty again. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing at my face. It was probably a bug in the system. Some kind of feedback loop or interference. I told myself that over and over as the night dragged on. The rest of the shift was normal. A lorry passed through around 3 in the morning and another car around 4:30. Both paid their toll and drove on. No one else mentioned seeing anything strange. By the end of the week, I'd almost forgotten about it. Things had gone back to the usual routine. Same radio songs, same empty roads. But then I saw it again. Not in the booth, though. It was on the news. I was sitting in the break room sipping a lukewarm cup of tea when the story came on. A car had been pulled out of a river 20 miles away. The camera showed them hauling it up the bank, mud dripping from its sides. 4 bodies were inside, a man, a woman and 2 children. The family had been missing for over a week. The news anchor mentioned the make and model of the car. I didn't need to hear it to know. I recognized the shape, the rain-slicked bonnet. It was the car from the monitor. The cup in my hand felt cold, like the heat had leached out of it. My head was buzzing. I thought about the headlights on the screen, the rain running down the windscreen. I thought about the empty road outside the booth. I don't know why I looked at the calendar then, but I did. The family had gone missing 6 days before I saw the car on the monitor. There was no explaining it, no making sense of it. The news moved on to another story, and the chatter in the break room picked up again. I sat there, gripping my cup, staring at the screen, long after the report was over. That night, back at the booth, I couldn't stop glancing at the monitors. Every flicker of light on the screen made my stomach turn. Every car that approached set my pulse racing. But nothing happened, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another quiet night, the rain falling soft against the glass. But I haven't looked at the monitors the same way since. Working nights as a janitor isn't exactly glamorous, but I've always liked the quiet of it. There's something peaceful about being in an office building when everyone else has gone home. The echo of your own footsteps, the soft murmur of the vending machines, the clean smell of disinfectant. It's mundane, but there's comfort in mundane. That night I was making my rounds on the 10th floor. It's a newish building, modern, all glass and steel, but the elevators always had their quirks. They'd stick sometimes or stop halfway between floors. I wasn't surprised when, on my way past the lift doors, I noticed the indicator light stuck on 12, the top floor. No one should have been up there. The offices closed at 7, and the floor was as empty as the rest of the building. I stood there for a moment, staring at that glowing number. It wasn't a big deal, I thought, just a stuck lift. I'd seen it plenty of times before, but something made me hesitate. I don't know why, but I felt a little reluctant to check it out. Still, it was my job. I grabbed the emergency key from my belt and pried the doors open. The lift wasn't there. Instead, I saw the empty shaft stretching up into blackness. I looked up. The lift car was parked at the top, just as the indicator said, its bottom edge dimly lit by the emergency lights. That's when I noticed the state of the lift. The doors had only opened a few inches, but it was enough. Enough to see the interior, enough to see the smashed control panel, the shattered light fixtures, and the streaks on the walls. Handprints, bloody handprints smeared across the metal, some long and jagged like they'd been clawed down the surface. I felt the air in the shaft, cold, much colder than it should have been. I don't remember closing the doors, but I must have done it because the next thing I knew I was standing in the corridor again, the emergency key in my hand. My palms were damp. I wiped them on my trousers and tried to think. Someone must have vandalized it, I thought. A prank maybe, a bunch of kids who'd gotten in after hours. That didn't make sense, but I didn't want to think about the alternatives. I called it into security, my voice coming out louder than I meant it to. The guard on the other end said he'd send someone up. I was about to hang up when I heard a soft chime. The lift doors were closing. I turned just in time to see them seal shut. Then the floor indicator changed. 11, 10, 9. It was descending. I broke into a run, heading for the ground floor. The building was empty, but the echoes of my footsteps made it sound like something was chasing me. I reached the lobby just as the lift chimed again and its doors slid open. It was fine. Clean. The control panel was shiny and intact. The lights inside were warm and bright. No smashed fixtures, no streaks, no blood, nothing. I stood there, staring into it. The smell of disinfectant drifted out. Normal. Completely normal, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had been in there. The guard arrived a few minutes later. He looked at me, then at the lift, then back at me, confused. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing to show him, nothing to prove I wasn't losing it. I left the building not long after that, telling the guard I wasn't feeling well. I went home and sat on the edge of my bed until morning, thinking about that lift, about the handprints and the smashed glass, and about how nothing at all was out of place when it reached the lobby. I didn't go back to work the next night or the night after that. The lift kept working, always on time, always clean, but I know what I saw. Working nights at the factory was monotonous, but I didn't mind. It was a paycheck. My job was to keep the line running, inspect the parts, and make sure nothing jammed. The machines were old, but they worked well enough if you kept an eye on them. That was all it took, really. Attention and patience. It was a quiet night, quieter than usual. The factory floor had its usual sounds, the clatter of conveyor belts, the hiss of pneumatic arms, the occasional creak of metal. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting their harsh glow over the machinery. I'd been there for hours, or at least it felt like I had. Time stretched out differently on shifts like that. There weren't many of us working nights. Just me and Simon that night, and he was covering the other side of the line. We usually kept to ourselves, only passing each other now and then when one of us needed to grab a tool or check on something. I hadn't seen him in a while, but that wasn't unusual. He liked to keep busy, always fiddling with something. If the machines weren't acting up, he'd find some excuse to clean or adjust something. That's just how he was. But after a bit, I realized it had been a long time since I'd seen him. I decided to check in. His workstation was empty when I got there. The machine he'd been working on was running smoothly, the conveyor belt rattling away like it always did. Everything was in its place, except for his gloves. They were lying neatly on the edge of the machine. It struck me as odd. Simon never took his gloves off while he worked. He was the type to complain if his hands got dirty. The gloves looked perfectly clean, almost new. I stared at them for a moment, feeling a strange knot of confusion in my stomach. I called out for him, though I wasn't expecting an answer. There was something about the quiet that made me uneasy. The factory was always noisy, but without Simon around, the noise felt sharper, almost too loud. I checked the break room. It was empty. The lockers were untouched, doors closed, the floor swept clean. I glanced at his locker, the one with his name on it. The padlock was still on, the same one he always used. The parking lot was empty too, except for my car and his. His beat-up Ford sat there under the yellow glow of the security light. The bonnet was dry, no sign of condensation. It hadn't been driven recently. Back inside, I walked the length of the floor, checking every corner. The storeroom, the supply closet, the bathrooms, nothing. No sign of him apart from those gloves lying there as if he'd left them deliberately. I went back to his workstation. The gloves were still there. I picked them up, turning them over in my hands. They felt warm. Not warm like someone had just taken them off, but warm in a way that didn't make sense, like they'd been sitting near a heater, except there was nothing like that near the machine. I set them down again, feeling my heart pound a little harder. I looked around, trying to figure out where he could have gone. It didn't make any sense. He wouldn't just leave. He wouldn't leave his car behind, or his gloves, or a machine running without someone to watch it. The sound of the conveyor belt felt louder than before. It rattled and groaned, the way old machines do when they're running at full capacity. I stood there for a moment, staring at the belt as it carried its load of parts past me. Then the machine next to it stopped. It didn't stop like it jammed or shut off. It just stopped, like something had hit the emergency switch. I stepped closer, my boots scuffing on the concrete floor. The machine was silent, completely dead. I checked the controls, flipping the switch back and forth, but nothing happened. Then I noticed something. On the belt, wedged between two of the parts, was another glove. Just one lying there in the middle of the conveyor like it had been dropped. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. It was identical to the pair Simon had left on the edge of his machine. Clean, warm. The lights flickered above me. Once, twice, and for a moment I thought they were going to go out completely. When they steadied, I glanced around. The factory floor looked the same as always, but there was something about it now that felt different. I set the glove down and stepped away from the machine, my heart hammering in my chest. The conveyor belt started moving again, rattling along as if nothing had happened. I stayed there for a while, standing in the harsh light of the fluorescents, listening to the sound of the machines. Simon didn't come back that night, or any night after. Night shifts at the convenience store were quiet, too quiet sometimes. It was a small shop on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just snacks, drinks, and the odd bit of over-the-counter medicine. I'd been working there for about a year, clocking in at 10 p.m. and out at 6 a.m., spending most of my shifts sitting behind the counter, staring at the CCTV monitors or scrolling through my phone. The store didn't get much foot traffic after midnight. A few regulars would pop in, people on their way home from the pub or lorry drivers looking for a coffee and a sandwich. Most nights it was just me and the hum of the fridges. It was around 2 a.m. when I took my break. I locked the front door, like always, and flipped the closed for break sign. I went to the back room, grabbed a sandwich from the staff fridge and sat down for my usual 15 minutes. I wasn't in a rush. There was no one around to complain. When I came back out, the front door was wide open. The sign was still hanging there, swaying slightly, the closed for break side facing out. The lock was turned to the open position, even though I was certain I'd locked it. The night air blew in, carrying with it a faint smell of wet tarmac and something else I couldn't quite place. I stepped outside and looked around. The car park was empty, just the flickering light over the fuel pumps and the faint glow of the streetlights down the road. There was no one there. I locked the door again and went back behind the counter, feeling a little shaken. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it properly. Maybe I was distracted, or maybe the mechanism had stuck. It was an old lock. After all, I glanced at the CCTV monitor. The screens were split into 4 feeds, showing different angles of the store. The front door, the aisles, the counter, and the car park. Everything looked normal. I rewound the footage just to be sure. I watched myself go out to flip the sign and lock the door, then head to the back room. The door was definitely locked. Then, about 5 minutes after I'd gone to the back, the feed from the front door showed it swinging open. The oddest thing was how it opened, not like someone had forced it, or even used a key. It just opened as though it had never been locked at all. And then someone walked in. They were tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. Their movements were calm, purposeful. They walked past the counter, down one of the aisles, and disappeared out of the frame. I fast-forwarded, my eyes darting between the feeds, looking for any sign of them leaving. The minutes ticked by on the screen, but the person didn't appear again. They hadn't left. I played the footage back, slower this time, pausing and rewinding, scanning every angle of the store. There was no sign of them. It was like they'd just vanished. I glanced around the shop, half expecting to see them standing there. But the aisles were empty. The fridges hummed away, their lights flickering slightly. The whole place felt off. I grabbed the phone and started to dial the number for the manager, but I stopped halfway through. What was I going to say? That someone had walked into the store and disappeared, that the door had opened on its own. I could already hear them laughing at me. Instead, I went out from behind the counter and walked through the aisles, my steps echoing on the tile floor. Everything was exactly where it should be. No knocked-over displays, no signs of anyone hiding. I checked the storeroom, the staff toilet, even the tiny cupboard where we kept the cleaning supplies. Nothing. I went back to the counter and stared at the CCTV monitor. The front door was still locked and the car park was still empty, but the footage showed something else now. One of the cameras, the one pointed at the back of the store, was glitching. The screen flickered with static, and for a split second I thought I saw movement, just a blur like something passing through the frame. I rewound it and watched again, but the static was gone. I sat there staring at the monitors, feeling like I was being watched. The store was silent, except for the faint buzz of the fridges and the occasional creak of the building settling. The shift dragged on. No one else came in for the rest of the night, and I didn't leave the counter again. When my relief showed up at 6 a.m., I didn't say anything about what had happened. I just grabbed my jacket, clocked out, and walked to my car. As I pulled out of the car park, I glanced back at the store. The front door was still locked, the lights inside flickering slightly. It looked so ordinary from the outside, like nothing had happened, but I knew better. I've been a park ranger for about 5 years now. The job has its perks: fresh air, lots of time to yourself, and a chance to be surrounded by nature. But the overnight patrols are a different beast entirely. The forest doesn't feel the same when the sun goes down. It's quieter, and somehow louder all at once. The park I work at isn't huge, just a few walking trails, a picnic area, and a small playground near the car park. It's popular with families during the day, but by night it empties out completely. My job is to make sure everything's locked up, no one's camping where they shouldn't be, and nothing's damaged. It's usually uneventful. It was late, around 2 or 3 in the morning, when I started my rounds. I'd parked the truck near the entrance and set off on foot with my torch in hand. The path that looped through the forest was damp from the rain earlier, and the air was thick with the smell of wet leaves. As I came closer to the playground, I noticed the swing set. There are only 2 swings side by side, and they're the old kind made of metal and chain links. One of them was moving slightly, the seat creaking faintly. At first I thought it was the wind, but the air was still, and the other swing wasn't moving at all. That's when I spotted the figure. It was small, maybe the size of a young child sitting on the swing. They were dressed in something dark, though I couldn't make out much more than that from where I was standing. Their head was tilted down, as if they were looking at the ground, and they weren't moving apart from the gentle sway of the swing. I froze. I scanned the area with my torch, shining the beam through the trees and across the car park, but there was no one else around. The playground is surrounded by a patch of trees on one side and open grass on the other, so it's not the sort of place someone can sneak into unnoticed. When I looked back at the swing, it was empty. The seat was still swaying slightly, the chains rattling softly in the quiet. I stepped closer, shining my torch around the playground. There was no sign of the child, no movement at all, just the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. I moved towards the swings, my boots squelching in the mud. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were small, about the size you'd expect from a child, and fresh enough to stand out clearly in the wet ground. They led away from the swing set, disappearing into the trees at the edge of the playground. I followed them, shining my torch along the path they took. The footprints stopped suddenly, right in the middle of a muddy patch. There was no sign of where they went after that, no tracks leading back to the playground or further into the trees. It was as if they'd just ended. I stood there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The torchlight flickered slightly, but I kept it steady, scanning the area. Nothing moved. The rest of my patrol was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me turn, my torch sweeping the darkness. When my shift ended, I drove home with the image of those footprints stuck in my mind. I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about the swing creaking and the small figure sitting there, still and silent. The next night, I checked the playground again. The footprints were gone, washed away by the rain, but the swing still moved ever so slightly, as if it was waiting for someone to come back. Working nights at the shipping yard was the sort of job that felt like background noise in your own life. You showed up, clocked in, shuffled around in the dark with a torch, and clocked out. The containers stretched in long, neat rows, towering metal walls painted in dull reds, blues, and greens. The yard was quiet at night, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the last person alive, just you and the hum of the generator keeping the floodlights on. I didn't mind it, though. It was straightforward work. Patrol the yard, check the logs, make sure no one was messing about where they shouldn't be. I'd been at it for 3 years, and not much ever happened. A fox rifling through some rubbish, a lorry driver turning up at the wrong gate. It was sometime after 2 a.m. when I noticed the drone. I'd been making my rounds, checking the locks on the container rows, when I spotted a small light blinking in the distance. I thought it was a plane at first. There's an airport not far from the yard, but it was too low, hovering just above the containers. I stepped closer, shining my torch in its direction. It didn't react to the light, just drifted along between the rows, bobbing like it was searching for something. It wasn't a big drone, maybe the size of a shoebox, with small, faintly glowing rotors. I stood there for a minute, watching it. Drones weren't unheard of around the yard, but they were usually bigger, industrial ones used for surveying. This wasn't one of those. It looked more like a toy, the sort someone might use to mess about in a park. I pulled out my radio to report it, but the signal crackled and died before I could get a word out. That wasn't unusual. The yard had dead spots where the radios didn't work well, but it made me feel isolated, like I was cut off from everything else. The drone hovered for a moment longer, then zipped off, disappearing over the far edge of the yard. I finished my patrol, glancing over my shoulder more than usual, but there was no sign of it. By the time my shift ended, I'd convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. Probably some kid's toy that wandered too far from home. When I got home, the sun was just starting to come up. My flat was small, just a one-bedroom place on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it suited me. I made a cup of tea, flipped on the telly, and sat down to unwind. That's when I noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, through the thin curtains of my living room window, I spotted a faint blinking light. I froze. It was there, hovering just beyond the glass, the same drone from the yard. Its rotors were barely audible, a faint whir that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It didn't move, it just hovered there, its blinking light reflecting faintly on the window pane. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The curtains weren't fully closed, and I felt exposed, like it was watching me. I stepped towards the window, and as I did, the drone suddenly zipped upwards, vanishing into the grey morning sky. I stayed there for a long moment, staring out into the street. There was no sign of it, just the empty road and the faint glow of the streetlights. I didn't sleep much that day. I kept checking the window, half expecting it to come back, but it didn't. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was exhausted, but I went in anyway. The yard felt different that night. The floodlights seemed dimmer, the rows of containers stretching out longer than they should. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that somewhere in the maze of metal walls, something was keeping pace with me. I finished my rounds and sat in the office, staring at the CCTV feeds. There was nothing unusual on the screens, just the same static-filled shots of empty rows and gates. But I couldn't stop thinking about the drone, about how it had found me at home. It was nearly morning when I stepped outside to lock the main gate. The yard was quiet, the air cold and damp. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard it, a faint, distant whir. I looked up, and there it was, hovering just above the nearest row of containers. The blinking light pulsed steadily, almost like it was breathing. I didn't move. I just stood there, watching as it floated closer, its rotors slicing through the stillness, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it darted away, disappearing into the pale dawn sky. When I got home that morning, I closed the curtains tightly and didn't open them again. Working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour superstore wasn't exactly the life I'd planned for myself, but it paid the bills. The place had its own rhythm at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, shelves gleamed with the kind of polish you only get when no customers are around, and the air conditioning hummed away like a distant train. It was quiet, almost peaceful, most nights anyway. That night started like any other. The handful of employees on the night crew were scattered around the store. Kevin was in the back unloading pallets, Sarah was tidying up in the beauty aisle, and Amir was stocking the frozen section. We all had our routines, and they didn't vary much. It was the kind of monotony you didn't think too hard about. Around midnight, the emergency exit alarm in the back corner went off. A shrill, piercing sound cutting through the store like a blade. It startled me so much that I dropped my clipboard. I headed over to the panel by the front doors to silence it. It wasn't uncommon for a stray breeze to trip the alarm. The loading dock doors didn't always close properly, and sometimes we'd get a draft that pushed against the emergency exit. Sure enough, when I checked the panel, it showed the back corner door. I reset the system and carried on with my tasks, but it happened again and again. By the fourth time, I was starting to get frustrated. The alarm wouldn't trip if the door wasn't physically opened, and it didn't make sense for it to keep happening unless someone was messing with it. I radioed Kevin to check the back. He came back a few minutes later, sounding confused, saying the door was locked and there was no one around. I reset the system again and stared at the little light on the panel, waiting for it to blink red. It stayed green for a while, long enough for me to convince myself it was just a glitch. Maybe the sensor was faulty or the weather was playing tricks. But just as I turned away, the alarm blared again. By now it was nearly 2 in the morning. My nerves were wearing thin, so I decided to pull up the security camera feed. I figured I'd see some obvious explanation, a loose pallet, an animal, maybe even Kevin taking the mickey. But what I found didn't make any sense. The footage showed the back corner of the store, the racks of clearance items stacked neatly against the walls, the emergency exit sitting in the corner. The door didn't move, not even a millimeter. But at the exact moment the alarm tripped, the screen flickered. Just once, a quick, barely noticeable flash of static. I rewound it, watched it again. It was so brief I almost thought I'd imagined it. Then I spotted something else. In the frozen section, there was Amir stacking boxes of chips. He bent to pick up a package that had fallen, and then he wasn't there. For 3 frames, less than a second, he disappeared. When he reappeared, he was in the exact same position as if nothing had happened. I paused the footage, stared at the screen. My heart thudded in my chest as I rewound it, played it back again. It was impossible. There was no cut, no jump. He was there, and then he wasn't, and then he was again. I flipped to a different camera feed, this one in the beauty aisle. There was Sarah, straightening rows of shampoo bottles. The footage flickered just like it had before, and she was gone. She reappeared a second later, still holding a bottle, still looking down at the shelf. Her face didn't change. Her movements were fluid, continuous, like nothing had happened. I checked Kevin's section next. He was by the pallets unloading boxes. The same flicker, the same disappearance, the same reappearance. I felt sick. My fingers were damp on the keyboard. I flipped through every feed, looking for something, anything that made sense, but it was always the same. Every employee, at some point during the night, vanished for just a fraction of a second, only to return as if they'd never left. And then there was me. The feed from the front counter showed me walking towards the emergency exit panel. I hit the reset button, turned to grab my clipboard, and then I was gone. Just like the others. Back a second later, clipboard in hand, moving like nothing had happened. I sat there staring at the monitor, barely breathing. The alarm tripped again. I didn't move. I didn't check the door. I didn't reset the panel. I just stayed there watching the cameras, waiting for the flicker.